Assalamu alaikum once again.
Alaikum assalam.
Okay.
Walaikum assalam.
Great. So we had some nice takeaways, I thought, from the last video from both of you gentlemen, and the dialogue became a trialogue, and certainly it's always they say that a three is a jamaat, so it's nice to have a jamaat here somehow, and even a virtual one. Dispersed throughout Europe, as it were. I think we have a gentleman in Belgium, and we have another in Bulgaria, and myself here in Hamburg, Germany. So at least we're Euro-wide at this point. Yeah, I would say picking up from where we were last time, some nice takeaways. We had Brecht explaining why he was attracted to Zaydi madhab, and we had Hassan explaining how actually all human beings are brothers at some level, and that's certainly true, and why sometimes brothers don't get along, and how we could restore brotherly love between anyone really in a global conflict, and more specifically now Israel-Palestina. None of us here are Israeli, none of us here are Palestinian, so maybe that helps in a way, because none of us are culturally or somehow in family invested in this issue. Yeah, sometimes it's very hard to talk about a thing when you are culturally invested or you are invested with family, right? Then it becomes very, very difficult, very, very difficult, if not impossible, to look at the other side of the table and appreciate the arguments of the other party in any way. Yeah. And whilst I think a clear judgment certainly shows a display of imbalance of power in this particular situation, that doesn't mean that the side with more power necessarily deserves less compassion. Okay, and I know that's hard for many Muslims to hear and understand, but I'm calling you from the country where the Holocaust happened not more than 3 generations ago. Okay. And I can tell you that here in Germany, you can go to, or in Poland, you can go to Auschwitz. In the south of Germany, you can go to Dachau. You can find the bones of the children of Israel. You can find remnants of soap that was made from the teeth of the remains of the gassed Jews. They did experiments on them, human experiments, like rats, they treated them, and did all kinds of horrible things that should not really even be mentioned in a book for people under 18. And so sometimes I think in Germany, our foreign politics are a little bit too lopsided because of the history of what happened, but nevertheless, there's absolutely no denying the suffering of the children of Israel, particularly in the last 100 years, and particularly in view of what happened in this country in particular. Yeah. And since we're in Europe with the 3 of us, I think we all know what the Germans did outside of Germany too, to other Europeans that were not Jewish even. Yeah. So imagine if they did that, what did they do then to the Jews? Yeah. So with all the imbalance of power, I try at least to find some level of compassion for a people that must be living in paranoia, particularly after the European experience. And again, this European experience is not only limited to Germany. This was in Russia. Also, there was a very, very strict kind of a non-discussed, really hidden kind of a Holocaust against the Jews. Also during the late 40s and 50s, in the time of Stalin, particularly, whatever one may think of his economic policy and military policy, but definitely the result is that the Ashkenazi Jews that lived in Russia of those days suffered a lot. So here you have 2 kind of sources of immigration, basically based in Christian Europe, through long hundreds of years of suffering of oppression and marginalization. And I think it's important to keep that consciousness in front of us if we're going to follow this path of brotherly love and compassion, because I think there's no other way. And I think if we don't generate that level of compassion within ourselves, we cannot expect the children of Israel to do it. Because their priority right now is to build a homeland. Because they don't want to go back to where they've come from, right? And as much as the Palestinian issue annoys me and thoroughly upsets me when I see people being bombed away during their holidays and their religious holidays, and we talked about that in the last call, or in the last video just now, in the first half of this call, you know, they could immigrate to Jordan, they could immigrate to Lebanon, they could immigrate to Turkey, they could immigrate to Syria, they could immigrate to Saudi. But none of these countries, I mean, of course, Jordan has done a lot for Palestine in the region. And there are much deeper political, socio-political, geopolitical, geostrategic issues at hand. So I'm not putting this out as any kind of an argument to say the other countries have to accept them. I'm not saying that. I would like the Palestinians to have their own country, and I would like them to stay in their own country, preferably. But the reason I say it is that they have a home if they need it. There are Muslim countries that could accept them if they wanted to, and many Palestinians have been accepted. But there's no Jewish homeland for people of Jewish descent to come home and feel safe, yeah? Okay, there's a funny book in German by a Jewish guy called Gibt den Juden Schleswig-Holstein, yeah? Which is a region in the north of Germany. It's like a joke, yeah? It's like a sarcastic kind of take on it. Well, why didn't you just give a part of Germany then to the Jews, yeah? Well, okay, why didn't we? Yeah, maybe that would have been the solution back in 1945, yeah? To say, okay, let's bring karma back to where karma was created, and let's give a part of Germany to the children of Israel, to let them build their country, right? Then there were many other ideas that were floated around after the end of the Second World War. Parts of Africa were discussed, parts of Argentina were discussed. Different ideas were kind of floated around, and even back before that, even the time of Theodor Herzl and the first days of Zionism and the lobbying that was happening at the British court, particularly, but also in the continental European centers of power. There were many ideas that were being tossed around for where should the Jewish homeland be, yeah? And of course, we know the history of the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, and the British goodbye present to the Turks and the Arabs of basically gifting Palestine to the children of Israel, very strategically, knowing full well that by this path they could exert an influence into the region of the Levant and the Middle East without really having to pay for it, right? Without really having to support it anymore. So the colonies, the crown was going bare. Exit strategies from India were under discussion. Exit strategies from the Levant were under discussion. The Americas had been given up a long time ago, yeah? So Asia had been given up a long time ago. So the British were pulling out all of their resources, but not without leaving little goodbye presents all over the place, yeah? So you've got the Falklands in Argentina, you've got North America in the hands of the British, if you will, still today, in many ways, unperceivable ways for most people. In India is another example. Pakistan, the division between India and Pakistan on the basis of religious preference. So, and certainly Palestine. So the British don't leave without a goodbye present, just so you know. I'm sorry for any British who are listening to this, but unfortunately, history bears it, at least, bears it out. So having said all that, and coming back to the main issue at hand, how to solve this issue, Hassan had his vision of brotherly love. And I really appreciate it. And I think there's no other way than that at the heart of the issue. So it's a great takeaway for today. If we were to take this one step further, Brecht, I'd be interested to hear from you. If you, first of all, if you share that vision very briefly, if you can find some level of sharing that, and secondly, if so, what would be your vision if you've brought one with you, and if not necessarily, what would be maybe if we were to jump on this idea of brotherly love and start to put some strategic steps into it, what would they look like?
Well, yeah, I think there is a lot, of course, to unpack. There is a lot of let's say, of information and a lot of developments in the region that have happened, of course, over the past, particularly 73 years since the foundation of the entity that calls itself Israel. But while I agree, of course, on a fundamental level, we have the fact that we are all brothers as in humanity, which I believe was also Imam Ali alayhi salam, who said that we are either brothers in faith or brothers in humanity. But in terms of, let's say, specifically the conflict plaguing Palestine, the problem is that we are faced with what I call a fundamental issue of occupation and colonization that is, of course, the exact nature of which can be debated, and how far this is a specifically Jewish strategy, or in how far this is rather a continuation of age-old, European Western colonial imperialism of centuries ago. But the problem is that we are still faced with that fundamental problem of occupation and colonization, and this is what Israel in the end is. Israel is a colonial venture, a colonial endeavor that was founded on the premise that starting from the idea, not one, that all Jews are part of the same race or ethnicity, which is something that I already have fundamental disagreements with the idea that a Jew is necessarily one people, one nation, let's say. At least with the idea, they have the idea that Jews are a specific ethnicity, like that would unite them biologically almost, rather than just religiously, such as the Ummah that we have in Islam.
Right.
Secondly, of course, the fundamental idea of Zionism is that they deserve the land of Palestine, the land of what was one the kingdom of Dawood, King David, as when you sort of united Jewish-only nation based on their history and their religion, which is something that I find fundamentally problematic, considering the fact that you basically reduce a religion to let's say, to an ethnic question rather than specifically religious.
And a spiritual question, right? I mean, in a way, right?
That it was, yeah, it was that it's yeah, you take away, and that is also, by the way, something that a lot of religious Jews who oppose Zionism have fundamental. That's one of their fundamental criticism, that the fact that you reduce what is a spirituality, reduce what is a religion to a purely ethnic nationalist matter almost,
right? Which
is then, of course, founded in a way on their religious scripture. They try to find justification, of course, in the Tanakh and the Torah, but this is something that I find, let's say, that's something that I find very problematic. And I don't think that specifically that only by, you can, of course, how do you say, you can educate people to get along and to coexist. But there is, of course, the fundamental question is going to be, what are we going to do with the millions of Palestinians who were forced out in 1948, forced out in 1967 during the two major conflicts, and are now living abroad, a lot of whom have expressed desire over and over and over again to return. They want to go back. A lot of them hold on to the keys of their house, but their houses are occupied.
Right.
So that makes it a fundamental problem. And I think you cannot solve that problem without addressing what needs to happen to the occupation itself. And then, of course, you have the two major questions of the one-state solution, the two-state solution. With the two-state solution being the one that is generally supported by the United Nations and by the majority of the world, especially in the West, at least nominally, except for the United States nowadays, who, of course, has accepted the idea that this should all basically be Israel. But my problem in that regard, my vision regarding that, I am personally more of a supporter of the one-state solution as a united Palestine, rather than the division between the two quote-unquote countries of Israel and Palestine. Because the fact that if you divide the nation into two parts, you have de facto accepted the colonized status quo that exists now. And that is something that I find, then you can of course discuss about which parts go to Palestine, which parts go to the Zionists. But I believe that the way to do this, the preferable way to do this, I think, is the two status quo entities that exist now should be united under one nation, and that they can, from that moment on, decide on their own future together. But in that regard, it's going to be important that this cannot be an exclusionary or an exclusive state. It cannot be exclusively Jewish or exclusively Arab or exclusively Muslim or Christian, for that matter.
Right.
And this can, of course, this one nation, this one country solution can only properly exist, of course, if all the Palestinians who fled after the war of 48 and 67 and their descendants that live abroad are allowed to return and to participate in a democratic process. And I think that is, interestingly, that is something that has been called for by a lot of members of the resistance against Zionism. And unfortunately, this call has been obfuscated by the Zionist propaganda, because as you mentioned, indeed, the Israelis and their supporters have been extremely good at playing media, social media, at getting their voices heard across the world, which has caused a lot of people to believe that everyone who fights Zionism is necessarily an anti-Semite.
Right, exactly.
And is necessarily wanting to massacre the Jews, or let's say, even though one of the major players in the anti-Zionist struggle, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has a pretty clear demand in that they demand that everyone, all the descendants of people who lived in Palestine prior to the Balfour Declaration, should get a vote in a national referendum about the future of the state, in which case you have a democratic solution. Of course, the Zionists don't want to do this because this democratic solution will be to their detriment, because they know they will lose out demographically speaking, because of course, when you
don't have the numbers, right? So they don't have the numbers. So
they don't have the numbers for that. No,
and that will always be their argument. The problem with that argument, and I fully agree with what you said, but the problem with, until now, I fully agree with basically everything you've said, except that maybe I'm not sure. I'm kind of agnostic about whether there should be a two-state solution or a one-state solution, because I don't like the idea, on the one hand, of accepting the logic of an ethnicity-based country, especially in this day and age. But on the other hand, I do somehow acknowledge the fact that that particularly the children of Israel need a place to call home, because otherwise everybody's going to be, basically they're going to have the feeling that everybody's going to be jumping on them, as has happened the last kind of few hundreds or thousands of years. So I'm conflicted, and therefore I remain agnostic on that one. But I'm happy to be convinced in any direction. But as far as what you just said, they don't have the numbers, and that's actually exactly their reason for saying this is why we need the Jewish state, because we need one place on this bloody planet, and for them it really is a bloody planet, where we actually have a majority. When it comes to Jewish issues, we need to have a majority. So that's actually the fundamental reason for having a Jewish homeland. Whether it's in Palestine and all the mess, and I get all of that, right? And I don't like it. And that's why I'm calling for this meeting, because I want there to be a unified and a free Palestine, right? But I just want to play devil's advocate a little bit, or even worse, Jewish advocate, much worse, and see if we can somehow see the whole picture, right? Yeah. And the numbers game is fine whenever you're in a majority, but I'll tell you, I never as a Zaidi, I lose the numbers game, not only in the larger Islamic context, but even within the Shia, I lose the numbers game. Okay, so I'm also conflicted in that sense. I always find the numbers game to be a difficult argument, and I noticed that even the Sunni Muslims in countries like Germany, and probably also in Belgium and France and UK, when they're in the minority, they always claim this is a kind of a pithy attack without, I don't think, too many Sunni Muslims around. Let's see if they jump on me on the video comments. But in the countries where they're a minority, namely in Europe and the United States, then they kind of pull the card of, well, we're the minority, but in democracy there have to be minority rights. But as soon as they have a majority, they jump on the Shia and they imprison them and torture them and kill them and repress them and make it impossible for the Shia to express their truth, okay? So even in our ummah, if you want to call it that, the numbers game is very, very challenging argument. I have a problem with it, even though I'm a firm believer in democracy, but there are issues with that. So I just want to point that out. Okay,
yeah.
And please, if you will, continue.
Yeah, so yeah, what I wanted to, I understand, in a way, I understand the issue that the idea, of course, it's understandable in a way, the idea of wanting a place to your own, but the problem is, and that is one fundamental disagreement that I have with the core concept that Zionism starts out from, the idea of there has to be a Jewish state. And I think that already conflates religion and ethnicity together, because the idea that they turn the Jewish religion into a nation, into an ethnicity, and from that point on, they start demanding their nation state, because of course the nation state is one of the fundamental firmaments of the contemporary political establishment in most of the world. But the problem with that being, of course, that we're talking about a religious community that prior to 1948 was spread almost all around the world. And even now, of course, there are Jews all around the world. And they only came together in their colonial endeavor in 1948. And even just looking at the Israel that exists right now, you see that there are some issues with the idea that they're all one completely united ethnicity. You already have in Israel now what formed some sort of upper class of mostly white Jews, mostly from the Ashkenazi class, from Ashkenazi group from Europe, with the Sephardi, Mizrahi, the Arab and the Persian Jews, and basically
the Sephardim, right?
And on the very bottom being the Ethiopian Jews.
Absolutely,
absolutely. In many ways, in some there have been mass deportations of Ethiopian Jews from Israel because they were not considered to be Jewish. And at that point, of course, when things like that happen, that goes to show, in my opinion, that they have basically forsaken the idea of religious identity, because the Ethiopian Jews did not have a different religion from the Ashkenazi Jews that lived there, except for some cultural differences like exists in Islam. But they are expelled for the fact that they are considered to be not racially pure enough. And that is a problematic factor, because there are many different studies into this, including by Israeli scientists such as Shlomo Sant, who is an Israeli historian, I believe, who talks about that the Jewish people, the idea of a Jewish people as one united nation, one united ethnicity, or one united race, is an invention of the modern day and age that has basically been invented to make them more, let's say, more acceptable in the eyes of the modern world, in a way. Because in the modern world, we often talk about, do we have the white race or the Germanic Aryan race, you have the Slavic races, the Arabs. But the idea was that the Jews had to be one united ethnicity, which in many ways they are not, because we know, historically speaking, that there have been such things as Jewish conversions. There have been Russian realms on the steppes, the Khazars, who accepted Judaism. You had the Himyarites in Yemen who converted to Judaism at certain points in time, and these people did not, change ethnicity. They were not colonized or settled by Jewish settlers. They were converted. And their descendants still live, but their descendants now claim that they are somehow part of that one united Jewish race that I believe does not exist. And when you then talk about the facts being that Judaism is a religion, and I think you have the fundamental that presents with a fundamental problem, because I don't think a religion gives you the right to a specific plot of land, except perhaps let's say the sanctuaries that you need to pray in. There is no, let's say.
But that's what they're saying, though, Brecht. I got to stop you there, because they're saying that the House of David is right under Al-Aqsa. So that's one of their fundamental arguments. It's like, you guys can't actually, and that kind of, again, that turns the whole colonialist argument on its head, because they're saying you guys, wait a minute, you guys came and you built a mosque on top of the house of David, right?
Yeah.
That's what they're saying. I'm not saying it's true or not true. I don't have the historical or archaeological background to verify or disapprove it. But I'm just saying that's the Zionist argument, is that you guys built Al-Aqsa on the house of David, and that's a colonialist. It's not we who are the colonialists. We're the Native Americans, right? And you guys are the British, basically, or the French. And now, basically, it's time to go back, right?
But that again is that's something that I hear a lot, yeah. But that is also
I don't say it's right or wrong. Don't misunderstand me, yeah. But
yeah, I know, but I understand why you bring it up, because that is of course the argument that they give.
Definitely.
But that's another conflation, and that's something that in Europe exists a lot as well. In Europe, they also assume that every country in the world had somehow became Muslim due to colonization and settling by Arabs.
Right.
Because they don't seem to understand, for example, I have my personal experience with Malaysia. Malaysia was never conquered by an Arab army. These were locals who converted to Islam. And this is basically when the Arab conquests happened in the 7th century, when they removed the Christian Romans, the Byzantines, from the Holy Land. You can say, yes, obviously under the Umayyads and the Abbasids, there were, let's say, Arab overlords ruling over the area who came from the Hijaz, who came from Najd, who came from the Gulf, right? So these were indeed foreign rulers, but they did not, there is no historical, and that's what I say often against this Zionist argument, there is no historical evidence that Arabs settled Palestine. They did not mass settle Palestine and remove the Jews from there. In fact, what happened over the course of several centuries, the Palestinians who lived there, for the majority, they converted to Islam, and a significant minority retained their Christian faith that they had under the Romans. But these people, the Palestinians, and that is something that the Zionists often fail to see or deliberately obfuscate, the Palestinians are not Arab settlers who came there after the Jews. The Palestinians, according to several research, the Palestinians are the people of Canaan who have lived there since time immemorial. For a major part of their ancestors lived there already when Musa and the tribes of Israel arrived. So they are a Semitic nation. They are in many ways, I am very certain, if you go back 2,000, 3,000 years in history, for the Palestinians that live there now, a lot of their ancestors were probably Jewish. So these were people who were the indigenous people of Palestine, and who are for a big part probably related to the Banu Israel of old. The only thing that changed is that they did not, of course, from a religious point of view, I would say they did not keep their religion. Of course, from an Islamic point of view, they did keep their religion, because Islam is, of course, the religion of the prophets, starting with Adam and Defa, and as affirmed by Ibrahim and later. But these Palestinians, they did not go along with rabbinical Judaism as the other Jews have done, but they are still the indigenous people of the land. Whereas a lot of the Jews who arrived after 1948, they are definitely Jewish. I don't doubt their religious beliefs, but they do not necessarily have the lineage to go back to the Banu Israel of old. And many of their ancestors were people who converted to Judaism later, which is no problem. Of course, there's no problem with ethnic mixing or intermarriage. I have an intercultural family myself. But what I'm trying to say is that being Jewish does not give you, in my opinion, does not give you the inherent right to claim that, say, because David and Moses and
understand.
This land should be mine.
I understand that that's your position, okay? And at the same time, since I'm the Jewish advocate in the room, or become that, I just point out, because I want to keep coming back to what Brother Hassan was saying about compassion, and about how if we don't find a fundamental compassion for the opinion and the viewpoint of the other party, we're not going to solve this problem fundamentally, okay? This problem will not be solved, I don't think. I don't think this problem will be solved by direct force or by direct warfare, or by, I'm just going to put that out from because I have a vision too, right? So I just want to point out that I don't think that and I think that if I'm wrong, well, the events of the last 70 years have not shown me that I'm wrong, because clearly all kinds of wars and things of that nature have been started against the state of Israel, and they haven't worked. So it's not going to work the way that we've been trying to do it before. And And therefore, compassion seems to be a very important key to solving this issue. If we don't have it, there's no way we're going to win it. We don't have the power, guys, okay? We might have all the arguments, everything you just said might be right, Brecht, but we might not have the power to turn that into some kind of a manifested reality on the floor, okay? So, the argument of compassion is helpful in the sense that it forces us to find other ways to achieve the solution that we need, okay? Which doesn't mean that we're changing at all the goal. The goal is the same, which is a free and a unified Palestine, okay? But the tactics might have to be different than they've been in the past, and the strategy might have to be different. And a strategy, clearly a strategy of compassion, if we choose it, would imply looking also into the theological arguments of the people of the children of Israel. And clearly the Zionists who are driving this seem to believe that because of Hazrat Musa alayhi salam, Hazrat Yehoshua alayhi salam, and all of the people, David and Solomon and all of the prophets alayhum assalam ajma'in, that they clearly feel that they have a right theologically to the land. Fundamentally, theologically, their book is telling them this is their land, okay? There's not really anywhere in the Quran that says Israel is, or Palestine is our land, yeah? If you look at it theologically, if you look at the Quran, there's nowhere in the Quran that says Palestine is our land. Okay, we prayed to Jerusalem to start the show, and then the Prophet Muhammad said, it's this way now. And he said, we're praying toward Mecca now. Okay, so if anything, you can argue that God said, it's not for you. Okay, so we have to be careful with these kind of arguments, because if we go into the theology, they claim a theological right to Palestine and we don't explicitly, okay? So Islam can exist. I'm going to be extremely provocative. I'm very sorry for anyone who feels differently about this that's watching this video, but Islam can exist without Palestine, okay? But there can be an argument made that Judaism cannot exist without a Jewish, let's call it a polity for lack of a better word, based in the Zionist homeland. Okay, I'm not going to agree with that argument. I don't agree with it, because obviously that would be a Zionist position and I don't take it. But I'm just telling you, this is what they think. Okay, so anytime you have differences of opinion, the thing breaks down. Okay, so what's the strategy to win the war? Okay, fine. I'm not, since that's not a part of my vision, that happens to not be a part of my vision, I'm not going to take this discussion there for the last 5 minutes that we have for this link, okay? And if people still have energy and power and time, we can go for a third link, and I think that would be it then. Everyone can check their clocks and their energy levels now. But basically, if we're not going to take a non-compassionate strategy, in other words, if we are going to take a compassionate strategy, it's not going to work without understanding the arguments also on the theological level, okay? And so unless you have anything you'd like to follow up on that one, Brecht, then I'd like to take maybe a couple of minutes to put forth my humble idea of a vision, and then we can see if we want to jump on that in the next link. Okay, so I think you've both said great things, and I think you've both said fundamental things today. And so even though we didn't have all 30 members of the Academy now in this call, we've certainly flushed out some of the most important principles that we could have talked about. And I think we've seen that the vision might be easy, brotherly love and compassion, and at least a free and a unified Palestine. And then we're agnostic still, I think, on the question of the state of Israel and what to do with it, at least in this call. but we haven't really taken strategic steps, and certainly not taken operative steps. So on the strategic side, I think I'm going to jump into it. I'm just going to piggyback on Hassan's vision of a compassionate, let me call it a solution for two peoples, if not necessarily for two states, okay? Because polities change in the course of history. And sometimes they have to change because of shifting dynamics in geopolitics. If for example, the British and the Americans were to leave support of the polity of the state of Israel for any reason, the Zionists would be damned to the revenge of the Arabs, okay? They would be damned to the revenge of the Arabs. And this is a fundamental problem of the Zionists that they have successfully closed their eyes on for the last 70 years, because they've been so dependent on the European and North American powers that they failed to draft a strategy, or at least it's not visible, what would happen if the dynamics in those countries were to change, okay? They'd be at the lions of the Arabs who are thirsting for revenge, basically, right? So this solution of what they're doing now, of the Zionists, what they're doing now, fundamentally, I don't believe it can last more than 2 generations. I really don't. And I think it can only end, actually, the good news, if any, is that it can only end in 2 ways, which is either in a 2-state solution with real brotherly love between the parties, or the polity of Israel is finished and the children of Israel are on the road again, okay? Because that's the way the dynamics are going. That's the way the youth in the United States is trending, even the Jewish youth. That's the way the youth in Europe is trending. And if these blocks of support kind of post-Holocaust and post-Stalinism kind of break away, then the Zionist polity cannot survive more than 1 or 2 generations with all the military might and political might that they might seem to have now. That's why, and I'll come back to what I said before, I was very surprised at the direction that the Zionist entity took on the last days of Ramadan, and it might actually mark a turning point in this entire discussion that we can't see now, but we might see it 10 or 20 years into the future. And having said that, I need to end the call, and I'll send another link, and I hope we can jump back into this, yeah? So,
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. Let's talk in a moment, please.